which will come of age and declare itself as one family. In line with the quote for the week from Hermes, Thomas Paine, the theophilanthropist and one of America's most illustrious and influential founders, said, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." This quote perhaps embodied the golden promise of the American experiment. America was founded on a set of eternal human principles, not simply as a reaction to unjust laws and self-serving persecution by the British Crown. Paine also said famously that the moral principle of revolution is to instruct, not to destroy. As a result, the unique circumstances of the American Revolution provided a blank canvas for our founders, such as Paine, Jefferson, Washington, and Franklin, to not only revivify the ideals of Enlightenment and Renaissance thought, but to articulate and carry forward those universal principles and realize a new civitas humana, or city of man. The American vision would become a template for the world. These ideals, the founders believed, would allow for free exercise of reason, religious freedom and diversity without the narrow dogmatic constraints of state-imposed theological belief. It encouraged a Renaissance-like rediscovery of the inherent good in all, regardless of caste or creed. These principles would be the basis for a national government established on the premise that all men are created equal, and of which any necessary constraints on freedom would bear in mind man's duty to his fellow man and allow the potential for each to discover that innate golden thread of interconnectedness, which must be carried forward in any future historical era where a new republic of conscience was the desired outcome. The American experiment was like no other before it, with systems and structures that allowed free spaces for individuals to relate to each other in the pursuit of truth and good. From a theosophical standpoint, the significance of America's bold beginnings is elucidated by many teachers. In his pamphlet, Echoes from the Orient, William Quan Judge said this, quote, "We are preparing here in America a new race which will exhibit the perfection of the glories being slowly brought to the surface from the long forgotten past. This is why the Americas are seen to be in a perpetual ferment. It is the seething and the bubbling of the older races in the refining pot, and the slow coming up of the material for the new race. Here and nowhere else are to be found men and women of every race living together, being governed together, attacking nature and the problems of life together, and bringing forth children who combine each one two races. This process will go on until, in the course of many generations, there will be produced on the American continents an entirely new race, new bodies, new orders of intellect, new powers of the mind, curious and unheard of psychic powers, as well as extraordinary physical ones, with new senses and extensions of present senses now unforeseen. When this sort of body and mind are generated, then other monads, or our own again, will animate them and paint them upon the screen of time, and paint upon the screen of time the pictures of 100,000 years ago." So here we have both a very profound and a very hopeful vision. The American Republic as the transition point in a stage of spiritual, intellectual, and physical evolution toward higher plateaus of civilization. It also gives us a perspective on the importance of our individual incarnations in this time and place. Despite the varying degrees of ongoing ferment and suffering we still endure, we can perhaps be encouraged by the understanding that those karmic causes generated in past lives have enabled us to be born in this current tumultuous yet fertile cycle. It also presents us with an ennobling responsibility to elevate our culture and prepare for future incarnations, our own as well as others. This responsibility, we are told, is particularly unique amongst those of us fortunate to call ourselves Americans. As the 19th century theosophical teacher H.P. Blavatsky said, quote, "One can be a citizen of the only land of true freedom in the whole world." Here it should be noted that HPB later emphasized with great clarity that by freedom, she means freedom of thought. This was later expanded upon by Raghavan Iyer, who said that America is, quote, "a country whose beginning is bolder and more glorious than the accounts of historians suggest, and into which came sons of the soil, as well as immigrants from all over the world, who, for the first time in recorded history, initiated a revolution through a commitment to principles embodied as propositions in the Declaration of Independence," unquote. So this perhaps provides us with a lens for viewing the promise of America as a beacon of light for the world. What then are the tendencies in current American consciousness that seem to go against the original hope, and what needs to be rediscovered? There are multiple challenges before America today, and one could select from a whole host of things. One question we might ask is whether we have moved far enough away from the de-glamorization of institutions. Thomas Paine warned against governments that exist for their own survival and self-perpetuation. He said that the ideal society was stateless, and to approach that ideal, we must first minimize the scope of government. However, it should be noted that Paine did later concede that government could play a limited constructive role in dealing with fundamental social needs. It is from Paine that we get such ideas as social security and a guaranteed annual income for all. In America today, we depend on government to solve almost every problem, including social problems and family problems, as well as practical ones. We've apothecized government to the extent that it has become, in a sense, a savior that can rescue us from our own self-created social dilemmas. Thus, it's understandable that one might be skeptical when our current president issues one executive order after another, promising that the government alone can protect us with the utmost certainty from viruses, can solve the hydra-headed problems of immigration by benign neglect, can bridge racial divides, or can browbeat the Supreme Court into not overturning Roe versus Wade. That the presidency and the Congress alone can overcome the deep-seated and unstable dynamics of bifurcation and polarization of American society by legislating morality and presuming to solve any and all problems, many of which are cultural, having to do largely with fundamental values. As stated in Parapolitics, quote, "Because of the collective wants of human beings, there is validity and value to human societies. No man can fulfill these wants except in the company of others. But unfortunately, men want to hand off the responsibility of fulfilling these desires to some external authority," unquote. So in contemporary America, we want government to put trillions of dollars into everything from climate change to drug problems, mental health, social inequities, and the eradication of diseases. In a sense, we've overloaded government with expectations that it can't possibly fulfill. Furthermore, we're a country that is often driven to react out of fear. Death, as we know, is natural, but we have not shown a readiness to see through the incessant talk of catastrophe to the constant presence of unavoidable suffering. The current pandemic is a good example of turning to government for what Raghavan Iyer called a once and for all solution. We have sought to focus on ends without regard for the unintended consequences of the means. In this case, the stated desire of complete eradication of a new disease has led us to adopt extreme comprehensive measures: school closures, masking children, economic lockdowns, and mandating medical procedures for an entire population. Driven by a fearful and overly dependent electorate and spurred on by the elixir of massive technological advancements, government now finds itself in an increasingly unhealthy marriage with science, relying on it for solutions to incredibly complex problems that it cannot realistically solve. As a result, instead of an agnostic source of observation, research, and discovery, science itself has become so institutionalized that it can no longer be considered the calling it once was. A very powerful warning about science and politics can be found, almost hidden, near the end of President Dwight Eisenhower's 1961 farewell address. Eisenhower was a very perceptive person who seems to have been able to see historical trends and potential challenges to America that most statesmen and political commentators did not. This famous speech is best known today for highlighting the danger of an expanding military-industrial complex, but it is perhaps even more prescient than that. So here's the very end of that speech. Quote, akin to and largely responsible for the sweeping changes in our industrial military posture has been the technological revolution during recent decades. In this revolution, research has become central. It also becomes more formalized, complex, and costly. A steadily increasing share is conducted for, by, or at the direction of the federal government. Today, the solitary inventor tinkering in his shop has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. In the same fashion, the free university, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. For every old blackboard, there are now hundreds of new electronic computers. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. And he closes by saying, it is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate these and other forces, new and old, within the principles of our democratic system, ever aiming toward the supreme goals of our free society, unquote. So today it can be argued that even scientists have fallen prey to the psychologically consuming fears and worries of today's America, and that today we still lack the healthy skepticism of science and technology that Eisenhower and others encouraged. As we can see, the original vision of America, which was based on a set of ethical principles thought to be eternal and universal, that of liberty and equality, and in a utopian sense, applicable to all persons in all places at all times, has become crudely materialized into what Raghavan Iyer called a desperate desire for embodiment. In his wonderful book, Parapolitics, he put it this way, quote, the great mass of men generate an immense pressure in the name of immediate earthly results, which they can parade and show. In demanding instant proof and repeated demonstration, they place an insuperable strain upon even the greatest leaders, most of whom fall prey to this temptation. He goes on, quote, but does that mean we should go to the opposite extreme and look for no solutions, posing as existentialists or nihilists? Is the nihilism in today's high schools the only answer young Americans can offer as an alternative? Can they not visualize small solutions within a large vision? They surely can, but sadly, too many people merely react and mistake posturing for pioneering, unquote. So to put this another way, quoting from an essay by a longtime member of the Santa Barbara ULT, the much noted politics of identity and of lifestyles has increasingly fractured the American political psyche to such an extent that, like Humpty Dumpty, the American mind is unable to easily reorganize itself into holistic cultural perspectives. American politicians, in particular, find it difficult to reascend into the spacious plenum of those parapolitical principles that were the implicit unifying basis of the now psychologically distant Declaration of Independence, and were the springboard of an extended vision of America as the refuge of the world's proletariat with their unique subcultures. The implicit meaning of the American promise was and is that America is the eternal friend of immigrants who fervently wish to begin anew and become equal participants in the liberating quest for the ever-beckoning and perhaps overly materialized common good, unquote. So these two ideas of, on the one hand, proposing small solutions within a large vision, and on the other, developing a readiness to see through the endless talk of catastrophe and fear so rampant in our media and institutions, are both crucial to the present and future maturation of the American mind. As Raghavan Iyer said, quote, "It is a kind of growing up which may for the first time make the vision of the founding fathers meaningful and create not islands of instant brotherhood, but new areas of initiative with unprecedented avenues of community, hospitable to discovery and imagination," unquote. The above seems to imply, or this quote seems to imply that Thomas Paine's original vision of withdrawing allegiance to the notion that government can solve all problems means that by such withdrawal, we gain a greater sense of self-distance, a greater sense of critical distance and self-reliance. Turning back toward local communities with creativity, imagination, and reason that match up to the noblest conceivable potential of the community. A macro perspective of Americans as citizens of the world, but a micro perspective of applications within a community. Instead of relying on external authority, self-reliance enables one to become an authority unto oneself, drawing upon the ageless wisdom of teachers, as well as from other cultures, past and present, but at the same time taking responsibility and learning to trust something deeper in oneself. This can also be seen as a mode for social organization, where it is possible to maintain ethical individualism without falling into endless subjectivism, and at the same time, retain a sense of obligation to the community. In individual pursuit of truth and goodness, we grow with each other, discovering our humanity through serving other human beings. So I'd like to just end with one last quote from Parapolitics, and it's the last chapter. It's the last paragraph in the chapter called Community of Strangers. If ever Americans develop a refined culture that is neither a technological civilization nor an imitation of Europe, which does more than doodle with gimmicks and participate in token gestures and symbols, they will have to learn from the sagacious Emerson. His perceptive essay on self-reliance suggests that creeds are the disease of the mind and prayers the disease of the will. As long as we petition and pray to some outside force for a magical cure, we have rejected true religion on behalf of false religiosity. Arthur Morgan's insight is apt. quote, "The problem of the community of the future is not to win acceptance, but to deserve acceptance," unquote. The future is indeed much larger than the past. If one takes man's age as over 18 million years and translates it into a 24-hour scale, 6,000 years of recorded history do not amount to half a minute. History is extinct for those who set limits on the future. Many people today are willing to cooperate with the future, unthreatened by the universal extension of the logic of the American dream to the whole of humanity. Willing also, despite past mistakes, to make fresh experiments in the use of space, time, and energy. One day, perhaps in our lifetime, some may remember these trying times of subtle exploration and say without smugness, "We dreamers, we derided, we mad, blind men who see, we bear ye witness ere ye come, that ye shall be." Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. So are you saying that you want to entertain a discussion at this point?
Sure. I'll just add that I am a very beginning student in all these matters. As I mentioned, I found that particular section of parapolitics instructive and invigorating and hopeful and illuminating in so many ways. And but I don't, I don't pretend to be a very studied student on the entire book itself. So hopefully it does elicit some input and some thoughts and some other ideas.
Bobby, I had a question. Just specifically with reference to, I think, a quote that you quoted from at the very, very end. And it said something like ethically individual choices. Now I'm kind of messing this up, and then it said, or you said, without subjective randomness or something like that. Where I'm going with that is, it sounded to me like if we're going to be individual thinkers and get access to actual freedom of thought and do real self-reliance, that we're going to need, don't you think where do you think that theosophical principles would fit in to becoming an authentic, original, individual thinker?
Well, I think from a theosophical standpoint, we, karma and reincarnation, those ideas, on the one hand, place an importance on individuality and taking responsibility. So there's a way of looking at it from that perspective, but it's also a I think we're supposed to look at it as individuals who are part of a whole. So they're not totally separate things. You can't just focus on yourself at the expense of those around you, because we are all are all part of the same the same source of higher being, and so yeah, there has to be some sort of a balance there, I suppose, that where we can act in individual ways that are ethical and morally appropriate for a given situation in a given time, while keeping a wider perspective on the impact our actions have on our families, our communities, our neighborhoods, the country, and the world. So it seems to me that America is in a sense, because of its illustrious beginnings and the original nature of our founding, it was a place where things like that could be it would be a template for or a model for something like that in larger society, that could be carried forward and envisioned and practiced at the community level all the way on up to the state and national and all over the globe.
Thank you. I think that we'll try the experiment of Kirk Radine. I want to ask you a question. Do you think we should just ask people to raise their hands, or do you think we should just let people jump in with a group this size? You've got a lot of experience with this.
I think hand raising when a larger group this size, that hand raising works quite well.
Yeah, why don't we do that? Does everybody know how to do that? You go to reactions, and then you'll see a thing that has a picture of a hand, and you click that.
So Judy had her hand up.
Yes, thank you, Ravi, for a very illuminating discussion. I just wanted to refer to the article by William Q. Judge, Adepts in America in 1776. It's clear that men like Washington, Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Tom Paine, although perhaps not Mahatmas, were perhaps Masons of the auspice of the day, in touch with a higher consciousness, and they realized that universal brotherhood could be brought forth on the new continent. But we have to remember the sacrifice that they made when they pledged at the end of the Declaration of Independence, our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor. I mean, this meant their jobs, their income, whoever they were, Paul Revere, a silversmith, John Adams, a brewer, Washington, originally a British military officer. They pledged everything, and if we had lost, they would have been hanged. And of course, Franklin was a scientist in the true sense. He wasn't using science in a political way, which it's being used now, as you pointed out. So how much can we really say that America was influenced by the adepts? And I know there is this issue in ISIS Unveiled that the very word America may come from Mount Meru, the great ideal of the highest mountain. I don't know too much about this. I think Carolyn Dorrance knows something about it. The idea of America isn't named for Americus Vespucius, but for a higher ideal. So how much can we really connect America with the theosophical principles, and that the idea has got to go on, whether our particular country does not?
Yeah, I think, that article is one of the ones I was hoping to include or pull some ideas from, because it's just an incredible thing to think about when you envision these, or you picture these men during this time who had such an important and arduous task before them, with all these sacrifices that they inevitably ended up making, who were in a sense given some kind of protection by the Mahatmas, and in terms of the meaning of the word America, that's interesting. I didn't know the history of that, or what was behind the naming, but I do. It brings to mind something else in that, and I think it's in Echoes from the Orient, where Judge goes on to say something about the significance of the founding of America, and the idea of, it being about souls incarnating souls incarnating on a new continent. But he was careful to say something about it, not calling it the United States of America, because the United States, quote unquote, it might not exist in its current form, in a few generations. So that's why he referred to it as the American continent. I thought that was interesting and perhaps telling. Perhaps there's something to be gleaned from that, in that, civilizations rise and fall, and there are cycles within cycles, as we know. So it's important not to get too hung up on the idea of the structure and the organization of the government itself. The Constitution allowed for certain things, incredible things, but the impulse behind it and the ideas and the principles behind it, I think, were what was emphasized.
Elton has his hand up.
Well, I noticed that the quote in the Aquarian Almanac for Thursday from Emerson says, "In our barbarous society, the influence of character is in its infancy." And then for the 11th, Thoreau says, "There is but little virtue in the action of masses of men." And you started with the Hermes quote for the week in the Almanac about a republic of conscience. And you spoke earlier about modeling. Could you say something about what an individual can do in a modeling way that has a real influence in the community and beyond?
Oh, let's see, I can try. I think there are ways to, if we look at what was said about the micro versus the macro perspective, there are micro solutions, there are micro improvements, there are micro communities, there are ways of working within one's own household, even to strive towards some kind of harmony and understanding and flexibility and adapting to various difficulties that we encounter as human beings with differing personalities or other psychological things that are part of being human, and maintaining that thread of trust and connectedness and understanding that we are, everything we do and say, if we're always keeping a higher ideal in mind, that somehow that can help us elevate our own situation, which in turn can expand outside of ourselves and to our families, to our neighborhoods, to our communities, and beyond. So I know that's probably not a specific example, but maybe somebody else has some thoughts on or knows of some examples, or can highlight people perhaps that they've read about or have known that embody those things.
It sounds to me like what you're suggesting is that what's really happening at deeper and more important levels, we never see in the news. We won't see it just going shopping and all of that, but that there are you're pointing to what seems to be very powerful forces that can work through individuals that will make a difference if we look to the future and don't get too constipated about the present.
Right. And we do, yes, that's a very good way of putting it. And we have a tendency, I think, to allow, the media to define us, or popular culture to define us, or institutions to define us. And those are hard. I think it's hard to be totally disconnected from those things, because you have to engage, everybody has to engage with those things on some level. So there's perhaps a way of participating in them without turning yourself over to it completely, and maintaining some kind of individual ethical and moral sense of being that and it like you, as you mentioned, it won't necessarily be heard or felt by the masses, and shared on social media, or become a new movement, or a new form of activism necessarily. It may develop into something greater and with some more momentum at some point, if it's founded in truth and goodness, as was put earlier.
Joe Miller has a hand up.
Hello, Ravi. Thank you very much. I was wondering about if you could comment. You made the mention of the trap of doomsday talk. And of course, we know our news media is sort of like, driven by sensationalism and chases the lowest denominator so often. And it's easy to look at problems and see, no way out of a downward tilt. So I wonder if you could say something about, positive buoyancy, or a kind of perspective that moderates. We want to critically look at problems, but how do we avoid that psychological doomsday trap?
Well, I think it was Pico Iyer. I heard him say once that he doesn't watch the news. I think those might have been his actual words, something to that effect. He just doesn't watch the news, and that's a really, kind of that's a hard thing to believe, because he's someone he seems so well informed, and yet he doesn't have to talk about current issues necessarily, or have an up to the minute understanding of things. But you get the sense when you talk to him or when you hear him speak, that he is somehow still aware of what's happening, and is on some level, he's in touch with something that still permeates the culture and the consciousness, despite the fact that he isn't scrolling through Twitter or Facebook or television channels. And so maybe there's something to that. You certainly don't want to go the opposite end either. You don't want to put your head in the sand and ignore things that are important, and that you can participate in, and potentially help other people get through, or in your town or community. So yeah, I think that's kind of a simple answer to your question, Joe, but that might be a start, because it allows, there is something, I imagine why someone like Pico advocates that, or at least for his own purposes, is it it must free him up to be able to glean the deeper meanings from the things that he does spend his time on and his energy on, and to see below the surface, the superficial surface of things. And maybe that's why when he does speak or when he writes, there seems to be this comprehensive understanding of things without necessarily having his finger right on the hot topic of the day.
Unless there's any follow through to that.
Yeah.
Laura's got her hand. Oh, well, Jim,
Yes.
did you want to do
It is a follow-up.
Yeah, please.
It's very well said, Robbie, and thank you. There's a fine line between staying informed and dwelling upon the news. That one needs to make sure that you don't cross that fine line. And I think that Pico Iyer is an example of what that means. You stay informed, but you've got the information, move on now. Move past it.
Yes, that's an excellent point.
Thank you, Laura. The Tepfer family has their hand up here.
I think Laura just said it, what I was going to just mention by just one thing. The song, it's just a song. You have to emphasize the positive, eliminate the negative, and don't mess with Mr. In Between. Remember that song?
I don't. Who wrote it? I mean, who is that?
Don't have any idea.
Joe does.
Hear it sung because you accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, and don't mess with Mr. In Between.
Yeah,
See,
that is the song.
Yeah, and so the whole point is, I think it's just beautifully put by Laura, but it's this one thing to acknowledge something, but it's another thing to appraise instantly its value and it's worthwhile taking your attention, and becoming something in your consciousness that is unnecessary. There are other things that need to be thought about and to be questioned, and to be thought out, such that by questioning and thinking, they get dispersed in a good way. They are giving a finer impulse by a purified monastic intelligence paying attention to them. And then there are things that are uplifting that you want to dwell upon without any attachment to their results. Just the activity, because the soul has its own good. And when it dwells on the good, that then fructifies the good, the particular good you're dwelling on. And that then radiates in every direction. And there's no need to be concerned about its particular effects at a particular moment. It will eventually descend into the realm of public consciousness in some way and be fruitful. So to accentuate the positive is not to be blind. It's to actually have a sense of discrimination. And every time you see some effort that won't be in the news about someone taking the initiative to do something helpful or thoughtful in relation to other people of the community, from a theosophical perspective that can be magnified manyfold in terms of the attention of higher beings. So there's every reason to be positive about the future. And in the article on parapolitics, he talks about the fact that there's so many, once you withdraw allegiance to the state in an overly salvationist way, you create more space, and you create more social space, and you create more community space where you can then imaginatively try to come up with things that are helpful to people, and not be waiting for some distant government to solve a problem. It puts more faith in human beings and their capacity to have social imagination. So there's a lot within it, I think, that we could consider.
Thank you, Jim. Robbie, do you have any follow through on that, or should we take another question? We have a thought. We had something from Maurice and Jenny, but maybe not. Not anymore, maybe. So I thought I saw a hand up from them. Monica?
A fun fact, first of all, Robbie, that was just wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
But fun fact, that song, Accentuate the Positive, is Harold Arlen and Johnny Mercer, the two writers, I believe from the 40s, who wrote classic tunes like that. But I wanted to say, in response to what Mr. Tepfer just got finished saying, this seems to be an excellent reminder and also a way to use social media consciously, which certainly could use a hand these days. So I think that being mindful of the idea of the higher forces coming to our aid when we take it upon ourselves to enter into these truths when we communicate with other people in the simplest way. I can't help but think that that wouldn't be really helpful to the atmosphere in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. So are you saying that just as the founding fathers were kind of influenced by higher forces, just so can concerned individuals and caring human beings somehow be influenced in the same way to some extent?
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that we gather here, I mean, thank goodness for Zoom with what the world has been going through, but we gather here, but it doesn't end here. When we leave here, the entire mix of everybody's presence and input goes with us. And so why not have that go into the arena of social media? And I don't mean when I say social media, I don't mean necessarily the classes that go on there. I mean, just interacting in general with people. I just can't help but believe that it is a positive influence. And some people only need a little prodding to come out of, the whining mode, which is what I sometimes call it. They just need, if there's one or two people in a circle who pull themselves out of that and head the conversation in the opposite direction, they're just looking for somebody to get on board with. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a formal class. So just a thought.
Thank you.
Well, I'd just like to comment that I think that Monica is absolutely right, that if we have real dialogue as we're having now, that we can raise the whole consciousness of the inner race psyche to a higher level. And the more people who do it, the better, instead of like sitting around watching football, as I confess I do sometimes. But this is really important because our government is supposed to be a dialogue, a tripartite dialogue between the court, the legislative, and the executive. Well, at the moment it isn't. It's a bit of a mess, as we know. But we, as the people, as sovereign, can come back, hopefully, to work with it and to improve it, whatever we evolve into. And of course, again, the amalgamation of the races is very important, not only in the physical genetic sense, but in the psychological sense, even more important.
I think Bob Moore has a question.
He does.
And
I have a question. And Judy's comments may bear upon this question as well. So you think about in the Declaration of Independence, says that we have certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I imagine that everyone in Congress would agree with that. So how do you solve polarity when everybody agrees with the principles? That's my question to you all.
Well, I don't have a good answer to it, but I know maybe the pursuit of happiness part is the part that we've overemphasized. I don't, in what I was reading and preparing for this talk, whether it was from Raghavan Iyer or Judge or HPB or Payne, even, there wasn't too much emphasis put on happiness. And if there was, it was, maybe somebody else knows this better than I do, but it was articulated in a way that wasn't quite what we think of it today as being, a relative happiness. So my happiness is what's most important, because happiness is different for different people. We have different standards or different ideas of what happiness means to us. So with respect to your question, Robert, maybe that's the problem with politicians or some politicians at least who presume to know what happiness looks like for everyone, and maybe they're making it personal. Maybe they're projecting their definition of their own happiness onto their constituents, and then if that's different than the politician across the aisle, well then, so be it. I have to fight for my constituency. But if we look at them, if there's more of a focus on the life and liberty part, those I think are, maybe those are higher ideals that are grounded in something deeper and maybe less fleeting or difficult to define as happiness.
But I should mention that, and probably many know this, that, of course, I think you're right, Ravi, about happiness. But the founding fathers, when they talked about happiness, they were more talking about a sense of fulfillment.
That's what it was.
Like not having a good time, but actually a creative, constructive life.
Right.
That's what they meant by happiness.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of gotten lost.
Yeah. That's the definition that I was looking for. Yeah, I knew it was something a little, something more, something deeper than that. So thank you.
There is did
Yeah.
I hear somebody about to say something?
I was just going to mention that apropos of what Robert was raising a question about and referring to, Gandhi said that the main problem that he saw, and the most difficult one really to overcome in a way, was not that people didn't have a sense of decency or didn't have a sense of what was really desirable, or that they didn't even have good beliefs. One can believe that a number of the Congress people are very genuine, or at least they begin that way. And they have hopes and they have aspirations and they have genuine desire to stand up for what seems to be representing the best, not only for their community, but for the nation as a whole when you're talking about the National Congress. But Gandhi would say the principal problem is the quality that's missing is the quality of courage. Is people can know what to do, but they don't usually have the courage to do it. And that's the fundamental problem. As the Gita mentions, as the first qualification of the godlike nature is fearlessness. And to have a sense of what it means to say you believe something is what is misunderstood. A philosophical understanding of believing something is you act on it. And so if you take a public oath before you take office, as Judy was pointing out earlier about signing the Declaration of Independence, that was one of the critical points, the signing of it, because so much was at stake. But there's not that sense of courage in relation to your beliefs, independent of getting reelected. Let go of getting reelected, have someone enter Congress, a few people really, who have no interest in being reelected, but have very strong commitments to seeing that Congress begins to do something real, and you could change everything, theoretically.
Thank you, Jim. There's a couple of quotes from Laura that I wanted to draw attention to. One is specifically apropos to this discussion. It says, it used to be only the king's happiness that mattered, right? So the pursuit is the key to understanding this. So it's the pursuit. Laura's saying, yes, you have the happiness, but it's the pursuit. It is a kind of becoming. So and I think that fits in with the idea of the fulfillment. And also, Laura has this quote here from Václav Havel to the US Congress. And Laura, would you mind reading it?
Sure. It's only part of it, and I recommend that people link to the whole thing because it's very good. One can approach democracy like one approaches the horizon. And the special experience I am talking about, he says further down, has given me one great certainty. Consciousness preceded being, and not the other way around. For this reason, the salvation of this human world lies nowhere else than in the human heart, in the human power to reflect, in human responsibility. And then further down, he says, we don't know how to put morality ahead of politics, science, and economics. And we touched upon that just in the last comment, that we have to put morality first. We have to put the ideal has to be first. Even if we never reach it, the ideal is like a horizon. We have to keep moving towards it.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant.
I think Ken Campos has his hand up.
Okay. Hey, Ken. Where did you go?
You need to turn your mic on, Ken.
I forgot to unmute. I took my hand up, but didn't unmute. I want to thank Robbie for a wonderful discussion and introduction to these works by Judge, particularly that, a focus, on that little section on the American experiment. I think that's really wonderful. And the Eisenhower thing was very touching for me. In my personal experience, I just want to echo that Eisenhower warning. In the late 1970s, I was a college undergraduate at the California Institute of Technology, and I saw the way some scientists that were really more true scientists in the 1970s were operating and functioning. And then the next decade, in the late 1980s, 89 to 93, I was at the National Institute of Health doing some neurochemistry research. And when I saw this vast disparity, because NIH was highly politicized. They're funded 100% by Congress. So those scientific work and the attention and what gets money was very politicized, even 30 years ago, or maybe 1990, 30 years ago. And I think that warning is huge. and so the question is, what can we do about that? And I'm not 100% sure of the answer, but I think maybe bringing awareness of Eisenhower's warning is going to be part of the solution there. And I'm really glad to hear people talking about how do we actualize and be models of these ideals of human awareness. And I think, you know, racial integration is one thing, feminism is another thing, to kind of bring some of these ideals more into reality, to model that for other people, and really, you know, having a sincere concern for the planet as a whole. And I understand our current administration and the federal government has picked up what Obama started to get involved in some reduction of, you know, carbon output by our infrastructure. It's a complex question, and I think the fourth point is less government. That's a difficult one, but I think my own direction in life right now is to not rely on the federal, state, or county government to take care of my little focus, which is people with schizophrenia, but really to do it from non-government NGOs, non-government organizations, as a way to do actions and be a model for these values. Thanks.